All right, we are here with no lights on in this room. Hang on. And now, now, let there be light. That was what we're going to study today. Let there be light. You know what happened when God said, let there be light? Jesus reached over and hit the switch. Not really. I'm without voice today, so we're going to do something real short and sweet so that I can make it through our sermon at 4 o'clock. It is Resurrection Day. Happy Easter to everybody. I figured we'd look at a couple of things that happened when Jesus died on the cross. Last week we went through Psalm 22, and Psalm 22 was a prophecy of the crucifixion. There's absolutely no denying it. When you're reading it from start to finish, it tells the whole story, and pretty convincingly from the fact that 700-800 years beforehand that was written. So this week, I want to look in Mark chapter 15 and 16. Probably stay in 15 and keep it short, just because, as you can tell, I'm really struggling. Woke up the other morning, I've been working out in my yard and in my garden, and if you live in the South, you inhale tons of pollen per breath, and eventually it gets you. I don't care how good you are, the pollen around here will get you eventually, and it got me. It just set up in my throat. So when Jesus died on the cross, there were some things that happened. And let's look at verse 38 of chapter 15 of Mark. And if you go back, it tells you this happened around the ninth hour when Jesus died. He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Some were thinking he was calling on Elijah, it says. And then he said, leave him up there, leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah will save him. But that's not what was happening. In verse 37, it says that Jesus cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last breath. We looked at, during our sermon last week, we looked at the fact that when these criminals were, at the end of the day, this was getting ready to be the Sabbath. And the Romans were very respectful of the Jewish Sabbath. They realized that Jews didn't want to touch dead bodies on the Sabbath. So out of politeness, when somebody was hanging on a cross, they would go up and break their legs so they'd die. Very polite thing to do. But that's how that they would make sure they were dead. They did not die of their wounds, such as the punctures. They actually, when they crucified somebody, and some of y'all may have even heard this before, I've had physicians that talk about the wounds that Jesus sustained during this, and it's mind-boggling. A couple of things. We talked about his prayer in the garden, where it says his sweat became like great drops of blood, a real medical condition. It's not hypertension, but there's something to that effect where you're under such stress that your capillaries bust and you could literally die from that. When he was whipped, they took a cat of nine tails, which is a leather whip with 9 different pieces of leather at the end. They usually have bone or some kind of shell tied into it, because what would happen was when they hit, it'd rip into the skin and they would pull it out. If you've ever seen The Passion of the Christ, that's a pretty gruesome, but they say fairly accurate. They actually said they had to tone that down for the movie. No, that's so hard to watch. Oh my gosh, if you've never seen The Passion of the Christ, watch it. It's incredible. The one doctor I heard said that they were allowed to take a cadaver, people who've donated their bodies to science, and their science project was to whip that cadaver with the cat of nine tails. And they said even though they weren't 100% sure how to do it, that they were just amazed at the amount of damage that thing did. Said there's a couple of times where those things would even go so deep as it exposed the rib cage. And Jesus lived through this. And he lived through it with a professional doing it, because the Roman soldiers that did this, that was their job. Just like if you join the military today, you have a job to do. Well, those particular soldiers, their job was to do that and scourge them. When they nailed him to the cross, one of the things that they could not do with Jesus is break any of his bones. So some of these doctors have tried different ways to nail a cadaver to a cross without breaking bones, and the only way they could do it was to go in between these bones here at the wrist. Now, that makes it very difficult when we take a literal interpretation as we know it, that they pierced his hands and feet. If they would have gone through here, there's two things. One, they'd have broke bones, but two, it wouldn't be strong enough to hold the weight of the body. Here you've got the wrist, and the way the Greeks and Roman described the hand, it was up. It was where your glove went up to. So that would meet the biblical standards. And I'm not sure about but your leg bones have similar spacing in them, and they would go in between those because your feet are up to where your boots cover. So these soldiers would nail people to the cross, and it would barely bleed. They knew how to miss the main arteries. So the purpose was not to kill them with the nails. A lot of people think you hit them with the nails and the blood's just running, but there's very little blood. It was, if you ever get impaled with something, with an accident, what do they tell you to do? If a stick or something goes deep into you, leave it, because it'll stop the blood. So these guys were really professional, and they were, the purpose of crucifixion was to humiliate the criminal and to have them up there for days. They could literally live days like this, depending on what shape they were in. And they would stay alive by pushing up on a little piece of wood that was provided down at the foot level, where they could take their heel and push up to breathe. Because when somebody's crucified, their arms are back and all the diaphragm muscles are stretched, so it's hard to breathe. So for them to breathe, they have to push up. Well, the Roman soldiers broke their legs, so they quit breathing. They couldn't push up. When they got to Jesus, they didn't break his legs. He was already dead. He gave his life. Nobody took it. So that's the importance of what we're talking about here, that he took his last breath. He didn't have to have his legs broken for any reason. Jesus his whole plan of coming to this earth was to die on the cross at that time for all sins, for all humanity. So, verse 38, it says, the veil of the temple was torn into from top to bottom. The importance of this. The veil that they're talking about is the curtain that it separates the Holy of Holies, where the sacrifice was taken in by the high priest. Nobody could go in there except a high priest who had confessed all of his known sins. When the curtain was down, and there were times where the curtains were taken down and things in the temple were cleaned. Sorry, that word didn't come out good. And new ones were put up because the temple stood for several hundred years in some cases. So when there was no temple veil, a priest could go into the Holy of Holies. It wasn't considered holy until the veil was up, which was that separation. So it would have been more likely if somebody wanted to rip the veil down to tear it from the bottom up, because this thing was about 20 feet tall. So if someone was hanging from a rod 20 feet above my head and I wanted to tear it in two, I would start at the bottom, right? Well, this says that it was torn in two from top to bottom. It was a supernatural thing. It was God symbolizing that there was no need for a high priest anymore, no need for a sacrifice anymore. And now you and I, as Christians, have access to the Holy of Holies through Jesus Christ. There's a lot of little subtleties that happen here that were for the Jews to understand more so than for us as Christians, because we don't need to understand that. We never went in the temple anyway. A Gentile, a non-Jewish person, the only place they could be anywhere in the temple is the outer courts. It's kind of like a public area. If you've ever been to a really old and big Catholic church, if you're not a Catholic, it's rare that you would go in there. But they have open common areas outside. When we go to Cuba, there's a couple of churches like that. And the open areas for just anybody, but only the Catholics went into certain parts. And we got to take a tour, and I just felt like I was so out of place because I wasn't a Catholic, and I was going into some of these places and I didn't know what to do. I was like, do I do the cross? I had no idea. But this was a sign to the Jews that the access to the Holy of Holies was given, and it was a supernatural thing. There is, let me think real quick. I think it's in Mark. If you go to Matthew, excuse me. I think Matthew tells about the earthquake. Yeah, in Matthew 27, down around verse 51, after Jesus had cried and yelled out, look at verse 50 in Matthew. This says that Jesus cried out with a loud voice, and he gave up his spirit. Okay, that's more to plainly say that Jesus gave his life. Nobody took it. All right, verse 51 says, behold, the temple, or the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and a great earthquake, and the rocks split. So these rocks split open. There's a place, if you go to Israel, that you can go to and see that they believe it's where the crucifixion took place. They also know where the Temple Mount was supposed to be and where this veil would have been split. And if you take a compass from Golgotha, which is where Christ was crucified on the cross, I hate to quote this because it's been so long, but I'm pretty sure that it's directly east, because Jesus is supposed to enter into the eastern gate. Directly east, in a straight line, as straight as you could get it, is the cross, the temple, and the place where the Holy of Holies was. I mean, when the earthquake shook, there is a crack that in several places that is exactly in line. If you were to go out and take a survey, they could shoot it straight in line where this crack runs all the way, and it's a mile or so away from where the crucifixion took place to where the Holy of Holies and this curtain was torn. And I just found that fascinating. Now, could it be a coincidence? Okay, maybe. I don't know. I don't think it was. I think that was God saying, yep, this is me. So, let's see. Let's go back to Mark. In verse 39, it says, so when the centurion who stood opposite of him saw that, he cried out like this and breathed his, wait a minute, where was that? Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I was reading something that wasn't there. So when the centurion who stood opposite of him, in other words, the guy that was looking at Jesus, saw that he cried out like this and breathed his last breath, he, the centurion, said, truly this man is the Son of God. I've had some people, seminary professors said he believed that this was the same guy that had his ear cut off. Now, I don't know. It doesn't state a name or anything, but that would be pretty convincing to me if I'd had my ear healed and saw this guy do this, that might be him. Verse 40 says, there were also women looking on from afar. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the Less, and of Joses and Salome, who followed him and ministered to him when he was in Galilee. And many other women came up with him to Jerusalem. Women in this day were not, they were second-class citizens. They were treated, they couldn't have their face uncovered. It's a lot like the Muslim women today. They have to go out with their head covered. The fact that Mark mentions this is, if you study the Gospels, you'll see them written in a little different style. Matthew's written in a very Jewish style. Mark is written in the style of as if Jesus was the servant. You'll pick up when you read Mark that there's a lot of times Mark would say, and immediately he did this, and immediately he did that. The idea is, when does a servant do something? As soon as they're told, immediately. And because it was written from a servant standpoint, he recognized the women who were there more than some of the other writers. So, I'm struggling, y'all, to get through this. In the next few verses, it talks about how Joseph of Arimathea went and got permission to take Jesus' body and put it in a borrowed tomb, one that had never been used before. But look at verse 44. I'll read verse 43. It says, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent council member who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, coming and taking courage, went into Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate marveled that he was already dead and surmised that, and summoning the centurion, he asked of him if he had been dead for some time. So when he found out from the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. Again, it was the Roman procedures, and it was common practice for them just to leave the bodies up there for as long as they could. Usually days before they died, and even after they died, didn't care if they hung up there, because this was a very prominent place. When you walked all around the city, you could see Golgotha. It was a hill, and you could see the people hanging on the cross. It's, you've probably seen some pictures and things of the crosses up on the hill, and they're very prominent. So Pilate was like, wait a minute, he's already dead? It's only been a little while. He was used to him being there for a long time. So when he found out he was already dead, he told Joseph, yeah, go ahead. So they got him down, took some fine linen and wrapped him and laid him in a tomb, which had been hewn out of a rock, and rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, observed where they laid him. And they were going to cover his body with oil and spices when they went and discovered that he had been resurrected. All that Joseph did was take his body and wrap it in linen. It wasn't the final resting time until it was anointed with these oils and all. So before we get to the resurrection, right after the death of Jesus, there's some really important stuff that happened. And the biggest thing is that temple veil being torn. That was the signal to the Jews that, okay, something supernatural just said the Holy of Holies is open. And it wasn't too long after this that the temple was torn down and never rebuilt. I think it was like 72 AD that they literally burnt the temple, and all the gold in there melted, and it was in between all the rocks. And the prophecy has said that not one stone would be left upon another. And they know that they dismantled this temple, every single stone, to get all that gold out that was melted. So I'm going to stop so that I can speak here in about 30 minutes. I'm sorry for the shortness of this. 4 o'clock worship time. Next week we'll be here again at 3, hopefully with a voice. And on a normal Sunday, we go out to eat after church at about 5 o'clock, and the church pays for it. So we'd love to have you come and visit with us, 742 North Anderson Road, Rock Hill.